Hey everyone, welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat, a podcast recorded on Gay or Muggle land by me, Liam Miller, he, him, his, a minister in the Uniting Church in Australia. Love, Rinse, Repeat is generously supported by Uniting Mission and Education, and you should check out their upcoming Preach Fest happening in the first week of June. Information is in the show notes. Today I'm very excited to be joined by Anne Elvey. Anne, welcome along.
Oh, thanks, Liam.
Anne, so go on.
I was just going to say that I'm joining you from Boonwurrung country in Bayside, Melbourne, Naarm. So, and I want to acknowledge the owners, traditional owners, Boonwurrung people, lands and waters around here.
Thank you for that. So for those who don't know Anne is a poet, a researcher, and an editor. And she is the Adjunct Research Fellow, School of Languages, Literatures, Cultures and Linguistics at Monash University, and an honorary researcher at the University of Divinity in Melbourne, Australia, my alma mater. And her most recent book that we are talking about today is Reading the Magnificat in Australia, Unsettling Engagements, which is out now through Sheffield Phoenix Press. And you can pick that up and get your library to pick it up. And that is, you're going to know why through this conversation. So, Anne, how about just to start with, just to wade into the book, just talk to us a little bit just about, what generated this idea, what got you thinking about this idea of exploring reading the Magnificat in Australia, what kind of developed, where this kind of developed from?
Okay. Well, a couple of things. I suppose I generally have been working in biblical studies for a while in ecological and feminist kind of approaches. And my PhD thesis, which was back in the late 90s, was on an ecological feminist reading of the Gospel of Luke. And then after that, I worked on, I was interested in the new materialism and how that connected with text. And so I wrote a book called The Matter of the Text, Material Engagements Between Luke and the Five Senses. So I've been working with Luke's Gospel. And as my poetry writing developed, I got more interested in looking at the poetic texts. So the Magnifica Benedictus. So I also have just a single paper on the Benedictus, looking at it in conversation with some of Behrooz Bukhani's writing, particularly about their nonviolent resistance. I think it was November 2017, I think, if I'm correct, when they were forced to move from one regional processing centre to another place on Manus Island. So I suppose I'm interested in how we can read texts in our contemporary context and perhaps pushing the boundaries of what biblical interpretation can be, and wanting to honour that biblical interpretation is not just done by scholars, but that artists and writers, often coming out of what we would now maybe call a sort of secular contexts, are interpreting biblical texts, not just referencing them, but even in referencing biblical texts, it's a form of interpretation. So initially I started with looking at, I thought I'd focus on local context and where have these texts been interpreted in Australia. So the initial paper I wrote for this was what is now chapter 2, and it was part of a project on ecological aspects of war at the time. And I found this short story written that was published in the West Australian in January 1939, just before the start of the Second World War. It was a short story by the Western Australian settler author, Henrietta Drake Brockman. So, and that was really interesting because the story itself, which she titled Magnificat and referenced bits of the Magnificat in it, and she was a protest at the impending war. So and recent scholarship on the Magnificat by people like Barbara Reid and Warren Carter has highlighted its nature as a song of protest. So that was where I kicked off, and then I started to look, well, what else in Australian literature, has referenced Magnificat, and I found poets, using it. And then for the poetry section, I expanded it because there was a lot more from North America that was really interesting. So I sort of cheated and went a bit sideways. And then there was this, I guess, an abstract expressionist work by Stanislaus Rapatek, a post-World War II migrant to Australia, that was, was called Magnificat 3, and it was part of this triptych. So that ends with, so he's got Kyrie, Magnificat 3, Dionysius. So it's sort of a cross-cultural, cross-religious references in the three pieces. So and I had some sense of how to read the literary works, but had to sort of think about more how to look at an artwork. And then I went to, then I was, listening to Bunurong elders. I started to think about, well, how do you read it on country? And then it became more difficult because I wanted to do a consultation, but for various reasons, some of them my own fault, but also various reasons and people having surgery and all sorts of things intervened, and that didn't happen. So I had to think about how to, as a settler, descendant of settlers, white settler person in Australia on stolen land, in what is still invasion, that we haven't, when we haven't got treaty yet, we haven't got past continuing as colonizers in this country. And so much of what we do, especially if we're able to feed and clothe and house ourselves, is based on this ongoing theft and dispossession and ongoing racism in this country also. So I was thinking about, how do I really sit in that space without being appropriative? And so that was where I started to think about, well, what parts of the story can I tell and what parts do I refrain from? And so, and there's also a growing sense of asking permission anytime you use Indigenous writers' work or allude to it, so that you're not misrepresenting it. So there was a little bit in chapter 2 that I had in, and when I asked the person whose work I was referring to if I could, they said, oh yeah, I did publish that. I suppose it's in the public domain and you could, technically write about it, but I'd really prefer you didn't. So I took it out. So part of that is what I would, so as I went along, I developed an approach, the hermeneutics of, I thought about, oh, that's kind of a hermeneutics of restraint, of things you don't say. And ideally, the flaw in the book is that ideally a book like this would have been a collaboration with an Indigenous scholar or an Indigenous, a First Nations writer working with biblical text in some way. So, but I think it's okay to do things that are partial and open up that there's more to be done. So that's probably enough from me in one go.
That's great. And that opens up a lot of the things I was going to ask about, which is one of it is, I want to come to the hermeneutic of restraint in a second, but about the this aspect of unknowing within the epistemological frame. So you write early on in the book, this is not reception history, nor is it a comprehensive cultural history of the Magnificat in Australia, but a creative engagement that builds on conversations between instances of cultural reception of the Magnificat, Indigenous work by women not directly related to the Magnificat, and the unknowing in settler epistemologies in relation to country. So that the conversation and the creative engagement become a form of biblical interpretation.
Okay.
So I guess I'm curious a bit about, I guess, that aspect of unknowing, and I guess how that influenced this idea that you wanted, and you do use country as this kind of hermeneutic, as this way in, but are doing so in this kind of, say, partial way. So I guess I just want to talk a bit about that.
I suppose it's I think we can sit down and learn with First Nations, as I'm sure many people have in different ways, and be given opportunities. So in the 90s, I had, and probably early 2000s, I had some opportunities through Aboriginal Catholic ministry to, say, visit Barmah Forest for a Duami retreat. So we, in that sort of session, you learn a bit about the history of the protests of the Yorta Yorta people, as well as spending time with country by yourself, as well as sitting around the campfire, as well as just learning, different things. And also early on as a BINAT partner, we had training that was, I guess, cultural training and things. Just learning very basic things like the rhythms of grief about invasion. Hearing from an elder that when I sort of said something about reconciliation, like this, no, solidarity, and so learning what you don't know. And I suppose, to me, I learned a bit back then, but the voices of young Indigenous writers now are really pushing us to recognise a lot more about our place here and our and to really unsettle, our sense of what it is to live here in this very difficult, space where it's, where people are still dying in custody in incredibly, just it's ongoing. But yet where there's this great groundswell of Indigenous voices that are really strong and resilient. And so I think, at first you can learn a bit and you think you know something, but there isn't, but there's kind of a principled unknowing about being here is what I'm trying to get at, I suppose.
Yeah. And that's
so because it's an unknowing, you can't really describe it. It's a stance. Yeah.
Yes. But as you say, then it then feeds into, as you say, those other aspects of the restraint of what parts of the story you're going to tell, what sources you'll engage with, those kind of things. It does obviously feed out into that in that understanding too.
Yeah, I think so. And unknowing doesn't mean not knowing the history.
Yeah.
There's an obligation to learn the history and to witness to it, but not to act as if you know cultural things or know even, if you're paying attention as an eco poet or someone engaged with the land, not to think you actually know what things mean. So that's the sort of thing.
And you have a line at one point where you talk about, that kind of critique of white ecological work, which often, itself perpetuated this idea of we've discovered kind of concepts of how we should relate to the land that were well and truly present and developed within Indigenous communities and knowledge systems. Yeah. So the book also, so you engage the book as a poet and a biblical scholar, you're right. And I'm curious, particularly with the poet part, there's a few things I'm thinking there, but one, again, how that, I guess, connects to the hermeneutics of creative imagination that you talk about, and this need for creative writing to turn the breath, to turn the breath towards empathy and resistance. So I'm curious about how do you think your work as a poet plays into this broader desire and what you want to see in biblical studies, even for those who aren't poets, right? What we're trying to see in the work. Yeah.
Well, I think, there's a lot in that question. I wish I could write something that turned the breath, it's for the reader to say. But I think, that bit about turning the breath comes from Paul Celan, who was a post-Holocaust poet, post-Shoah poet. And if you don't, his poetry is just amazing. And in this essay, he says poetry goes the way of art. And he talks about, and perhaps its purpose is to turn the breath. So he talks about an Atemwende, a breath turn. And there's a whole sequence of poems called Breath Turn. And I guess it's a bit like, I remember reading one of Deborah Bird Rose's chapters in her book, Reports from a Wild Country. And it was describing how religions in some remote communities had imposed themselves. This is in the late 20th century, and like built, say, a church on an old burial ground on purpose. And it's quite complex, the whole story of that. But I got to the end of the chapter and I found I was holding my breath. And I spoke to Deborah about it at one point, and she said, I wrote it so that would happen. So I think you recognize when a piece of writing does it. So it's not going to be everything. And I don't know that this does it. It's just that there's a sense in which it would be great if, like great poems engage your body, they leave you breathing differently. And poetry has a really interesting connection to the breath because of its spaces and line endings and things like that. But I think, a piece of really insightful scholarship can do it too. So the bit about creative imagination, that's from Schussler Fiorenza. She has these feminist hermeneutics, and one of hers is creative. And I do reference her in there.
Yeah.
It's not me.
No.
So she's well worth returning to. And I think it's really interesting that the critiques say of that's coming out about ecofeminists or eco-philosophy in some respects from some Indigenous scholars that we haven't acknowledged where some of the ideas of interconnectedness and kinship and various notions have come from. When you look back at Schussler Fiorenza's work, she does acknowledge a whole lot of scholars of colour in her development of the notion of kyriarchy. So I think, including, Bell Hooks, who's one of the early ones. So I think that hermeneutic circle that Schussler Fiorenza works with can be adapted to other forms beyond or including, but not simply feminist hermeneutics.
Thank you for that.
And always have to have suspicion there.
Yes. Oh yeah. They can't jump that step.
No.
So turning to the Magnificat itself. So as you mentioned earlier, recognizes this kind of song of protest, has these great reversals, right? That draw so many to it, that the mighty be cast down off their thrones, the rich sent away empty. And so we often, folks love to gravitate toward it and hold it as this rallying cry. But one of the interesting things you point out is that the reversals of the Magnificat are only sensible after the imposition of colonization. Right? You don't need these reversals if the song is not being sung by Mary, a woman under imperial colonization, enforcing upon them. They're not going to be a rallying cry necessarily in these lands now called Australia if the invasion project is not still well and truly underway.
So
go on.
No, that's right.
Yeah. So the idea is that the reversals come within the colonial apparatus, right? So the colonial apparatus comes and brings the Bible as a tool, as a resource, as part of that thing. And then within that, yes, are these reversals, which we cling to and love. But in some ways, it's like, better know Magnificat, right? Better know context in which it's required. And so I'm wondering whether then there's a tension to, yes, how, that we find life and hope and resilience and grit in those reversals, in that script, in that poem and song, but that we also acknowledge that it comes, that's there because of this much broader context, which we wouldn't wish upon anyone.
Well, I think in that sense, you could say that about the Bible itself, in terms of, it means many things in this context. It came as, a material artifact of the colonizers. Whether the stories got here earlier is a bit unclear, because they might have come through intermittent trade in North and Western Australia. Various Christian or religious stories may have arrived earlier. I've only heard anecdotal evidence about some of that, but so I don't know at all. But I think, it's just so complex, because there are many Indigenous Christians for whom the Bible stories are really, the Bible itself and the stories are really important, and they've been enculturated into local First Nations traditions. So it's, but yes, and I don't know, I just think it, I respect that it's something that you might want to reject as totally colonial. As a symbol and as an artifact. I just don't think there's one simple answer to that. And so the text itself, and the thing about the reversals is that they're not great in themselves. There's one way of seeing them as reinforcing the imperial project by just turning it around, but still using the same language. So yeah.
I think that's important. That comes across in the work, definitely, that it is complex, and that's where that suspicion comes from, and recognizing kyriarchy. It's like that you can't just go like, oh yes, it's this entirely this thing of resistance, no. But that there's obviously potential for it and parallels. But yes, it's not something that's just easily, you got to acknowledge that it all comes together, right? I think, as you say, as you're saying, and
and so I respect people who didn't want their work talked about in the book because they don't see themselves as religious in a Western kind of way.
So I guess thinking with the Magnificat, how do you feel it does, you have this quote in the book, reconfigure the learned desire of the will of white possession, which is like you wrestle with a lot, you wrestle with a lot in the book. But so how do you think the Magnificat helps with that reconfiguring?
The Magnificat or reading it?
The
reading of it.
I'll let you go with both.
Well, I don't think the Magnificat itself does that. I think it's how we read.
Cool. Yep.
Perhaps. And it's how we approach texts or our being in this place. So I suppose I wouldn't see it as, a particular text in itself. It's about being open to rethinking. So I guess one thing that's going through my head is what I tried to do with one of the poem responses, the one where I set Mary and Elizabeth in the Western Australian wheat belt and tried to incorporate some of the colonial history of my own family or, ancestors. without. So important thing to try and not do is to not keep putting in not keep copying or reproducing the trauma of what happened, or not without shifting things. So originally I stopped that before the coda, that piece, and the coda says she stops, she listens. And that's really important, that that piece ends up with the white protagonist listening. And that's where the book ends too, I think. And you think of Duncan Reid's new book, you know, It's Time We Started Listening. So I think, I mean, the process of writing it was unsettling because I had to grapple with questions about what I could do, who I, and what I hadn't been able to do, like the collaboration part. Because the difficulty with collaboration is it's better if we're asked to collaborate as non-Indigenous scholars, rather than imposing it yet again on people who might be much more, you know, who have other, whose our interests aren't necessarily the primary interest. So I think it was good to be in the uncomfortable space.
So how was that process of, you know, with your own poetic writings and reflections? Like, so some of them you were returning to, ones that had been done before, and so I guess,
I know,
considering them within this broader project, right? How did you find that? How do you feel that spoke into the other sections of the book?
Well, I mean, it was interesting. Obviously, I've been hanging around this text for a while. Because when I did a little chapbook that was a fundraiser for all the poems in it were connected to the Magnificat. I mean, that's what I did. And I had one called Glory, thinking about the idea of glory. Or it was meant, I don't know if I called it Glory in the end, but so there were little bits of those got in. The other poems, so the one at the end of chapter 2, the main one, it was actually related to that chapter from early on, I think. Or it came after the chapter anyway. Perhaps it was for a project on To End All Wars. There was a collection came out. And the others, so some of them are kind of visual things too, that sort of, so when I was saying about the problematics of the Magnificat, one of the visual things just cuts out some of the words and you get in it the remember mercy part, but the other one is empty power when it cuts out other words. So they're meant to sort of echo the abstract expressionist part of the abstract expressionist work, but comment on the text. So they would kind of be seen as perhaps visual poems. I don't know. And then I suppose another thing that has exercised me in recent years, because we were whistleblowers in the 90s in relation to our parish, with too late, I mean, not too late, but later than we should have been, about a priest who was an abuser. And so I've been exercised in recent years post the Royal Commission with the power dynamics involved in that, as well as, I mean, obviously the primary issues of abuse, but also the cover-ups and that power dynamics and that. So that comes into the book too, because I think it's very hard to read the Bible in Australia without being aware of that context also. I don't know. Have I strayed away from your question?
No, this is all, this is all very pertinent. I guess, just thinking about, as you even say, just reading it in that way, that looking for those words, those phrases, those things that open it up, that unsettle us, you know, is very much part of that, that getting rid of that will for white possession, getting, you know, is by letting oneself be unsettled and opening up to the different narratives and voices.
Well, look, I think that it's a lifetime's work getting because we're so it's like patriarchy. I mean, patriarchy is just so resilient, you know, it just bounces back. And I think our possessiveness in this place is just so ingrained, and our entitlement is so ingrained that it's something we have to conscientiously undo. And if by not seeing the Magnificat as this triumphant sounding piece, but as coming out from as a protest song from someone who, well, probably wasn't a slave, but is identifying with enslaved peoples in some way. I mean, I think that's still problematic, you know, Mary calling herself a slave when she probably wasn't a slave, you know, but it's sort of, I mean, these are just all things we've been taught to think about now. So I just think there's lots that we can do. And I suppose I also want to push that explorative kind of biblical studies that goes across these boundaries is biblical studies. It's a way of, you know, so sure you hang a bit of it on literary reading and on historical criticism and what, you know, commentators have found, but and obviously reading the primary texts, but I think, you know, we really need to work between cultures, you know, our contemporary culture and the ancient cultures and of the text, you know, and open up what it might be without necessarily seeing it as normative for anyone's faith. I mean, I know it is normative for some people, but not making that the kind of God. But I know some people it is. I mean,
No, that's really great and very helpful. And I really appreciate that kind of concept, you know, that it's a long process. It's not something that's just solved by like, here's the one declarative statement of how you read the Magnificat in Australia. It's the long work. So earlier you mentioned, you know, how chapter 2 considers the Magnificat in context of conflict. And so you're drawing in this settler story from 1939, but then also you use that to kind of move broader, to a less anthropocentric concept of the conflict that we're in now. And you draw in this concept of entanglement. And your own ecologically oriented rewritings of the Magnificat. So could you talk to us a little bit about your work with the Magnificat and you know, ecological hermeneutics, ecological theology, how the Magnificat serves that end, I guess, to some degree.
Okay, I suppose, I mean, one thing that was going through my mind when you were talking before in terms of that is using an ecological hermeneutic with an ear to the Magnificat, or with an ear to an ecological sort of hermeneutic and looking at the Magnificat, it makes it kind of, clearly there are no other animals referenced in the Magnificat, and the land isn't referenced directly. But if you hear Abraham, Isaac, you know, Abraham and, you know, descendants, and the covenant, you know, the promise covenant, then land is there. So for a first century audience, the land would have been just, you know, even if it can be occupied land, but it's still there in the. So Now, I think is it Alan? Anyhow, now I've forgotten, but I think it's Alan Davis makes the argument, that the 12, all of those references in the New Testament,
yes.
The land is there.
Yes.
Let me just see if it is. Oh, that's not in there. So I'm not sure. Now I've forgotten the reference, but there's a scholar who makes a very good case for the references to the 12, really reminding people of the land, so that the land isn't absent in the New Testament, which used to be Second Testament. It used to be, it was there in the Hebrew Bible, but not in the Second New Testament. So it's there. Also, when, and this is probably stretching the actual text, but when you hear generations, you don't have to just hear human generations now. Generations is more than human. It's other creatures. It's the whole. I don't think we have to stick with a first century reading of a word like generations, because we have a different understanding of our generation.
Yep.
If you want to call it evolutionary or, cosmically. So I think things like that give you a way into texts that don't directly reference so-called ecological, ideas. And then you can think about who are the poor now, who are, who can't eat. If someone's habitat is totally destroyed by, billions of creatures lost their habitats in the fires. So who, even if you're going with a linear kind of reading of reversals, they don't have to just be about humans. So I guess one of the things I'd written a while back was sort of trying to push that a little bit. So, but I'd want to read it with the grain of the text and somewhat sideways to the grain of the text, both, not just choose one or the other.
Thank you for that. So I guess, a moment ago I said it's not a simple process, but I'm just curious, if you were to say to someone, if someone is soon to preach on the Magnificat, or someone's Bible study or personal devotional reading plan is just about to turn that page,
right.
Obviously they're going to go and get the book and read the book. We're all going to do that, folks.
No, I don't expect that.
But if you had, one kind of, not a closing word, but an opening word for folks to consider as they look at the text again, that's come from your engagement, your rich engagement here, what would you be offering people in that kind of context?
All right. I would suggest, and I did do this when I was talking about the Magnificat to a group of Anglican clergy down in Gippsland, I think the year before last, obviously. Couldn't have been last year because we were going nowhere middle of the year last year. I think I would say that it pushes us to listen to the voices of women who are protesting now. So like Kathy Jetchell-Kitchener, the poet of the Marshall Islands, who writes about climate change and the nuclear threat, damage that's been done there. People like Natalie Harkin here, and any Indigenous woman, First Nations woman poet, Janine Lane, Natalie Harkin. I mean, don't just listen to the Luke and Mary, listen to the women who are doing this now. And really, there are so many women writing their own poems, songs of protest that are potent and that we really do need to hear. So that would be my takeaway.
I appreciate that. That's great. And I think, it's interesting, even when you think about it, like, with the Magnificat drawing on on its own rich cultural tradition, right? The songs of Miriam, the song of Hannah, that's already inbuilt in what comes to us here. And so, if anything, that should encourage our own process of listening to the songs and the forms around us and how they shape, how we approach such a work.
And that our own writing can build on rich traditions.
Yes.
Yeah.
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 Well, thank you for that. And thank you for this conversation. It has been wonderful. I'll close and then I'll ask if you have anything to plug, but I was going to read this as a final encouragement to folks. This is from toward the end of the first chapter. Just an encouragement again. This book lays out a creative reading approach whereby a counter-colonial eco-aesthetic hermeneutics is performative, enacting conversations between Indigenous women's writing and art, cultural receptions of biblical texts and the biblical texts themselves, producing creative responses to these conversations with a view to inviting and enabling ethical responses to the legacies of colonization in the present. If that's not an encouragement and an invitation to pick up the book or get your library to get the book in, then I don't know what is. So the book, Reading the Magnificat in Australia, Unsettling Engagements, out now with Sheffield Phoenix Press. Anne Elvey, thank you for joining us. Is there anything else you want to draw our listeners' attention to?
A different book?
Great, let's do it.
So, this project I was involved in that ended up with the Earth at Peace conference, or not ended up, but had the Earth at Peace conference in April 2019, had a book edited by Joe Camilleri and Deborah Guess, came out of it, a scholarly book. But I am just finishing reading through the proofs of this collection based on, so I don't know if you can see it.
Cloud Climbers. I'm just reading for the podcast folks there.
Okay, so Cloud Climbers. Oh, it's podcast. Okay.
It's both.
Okay. Cloud Climbers, Declarations Through Images and Words for a Just and Ecologically Sustainable Peace, artworks by William Kelly and Benjamin McCowner. I'm the editor, and it has poets, scholars and activists. And basically the framework of the book is about 8 or 9 images by the artists and poems in response to half a dozen of those images. This was part of the conference. And then a number of very short essays. So by people like Deborah Story on her experience in Afghanistan. And we end up with a prayer by Gary Deverell, Gary Werty Deverell, that you can, it is online anyway, but you know.
Former guest of the podcast.
Yeah, and so there's a bit of feminist liberation theology in there. There's about Catholic nonviolence. Sienna Hervea, who may have been one of your guests, has, or if not, you might want to have him as a guest. He has a fantastic essay on AO Cloud in it. So it's just, it's a short publication, but it should be very attractive, and just a bit of something to read a bit of here and there. Not heavy scholarship.
No, bedtime, read a piece before bed kind of thing.
Or else have it on your coffee table.
Yes, there you go. Find a little sunny nook. So, well, we might have to get you on again.
Actually,
when that comes out.
I'll stick it in the chat for you.
Great. So that'll be in the show notes, folks, for anyone who's interested in some more information there. And maybe we'll get you back on the podcast when it's,
I can find it
closer to the time.
Anyway, I'll email it to you if I can't figure out how to put it in the chat.
Sounds great.
Where's it's coming up? Oh, well, I don't know.
That's all right. Well,
are we still on?
We are. We'll just finish up.
Okay.
People love the peek behind the screen, the business of how this thing gets done. So that's a thrill for those who are listening to the end. So everyone, and thank you once again for coming on Love, Rinse, Repeat. It's been just a blast to have you.
Okay. Thanks, Liam.
No worries. And folks, we'll see you all next week.
Okay.